We're back, man. We're back here in Tribeca for part 2 with our great guest, Loretta Kennedy.
Hi.
Did you enjoy the break?
I did.
All right, we're going to cover some great stuff here. I've been doing a little research on you, Loretta. And when I talk about a little research, I'm talking about very little. I looked you up on Facebook, and I noticed that you were part of a lot of different little groups. Like you're fond of animals, right? Would you consider yourself an animal activist?
Not an activist, but yes, the Furry Friends Ranch in
Yeah.
South Florida. Yeah, that's where I got my little rescue dog from.
Okay, yeah, I saw
Yeah,
that you promoted
great little
them.
place.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of what else you had on the page there.
She's a biker.
I sold my Harley.
Did you really?
Oh, you
did.
had a motorcycle?
I
You mean
did.
Harley? I thought you meant like a
Yeah.
bicycle.
No, she was a motorcycle enthusiast.
I always tell people I'm a bike. I got a Schwinn. 6-speed.
Looking for the run and
So you had a Harley, huh?
I did.
That must have been awesome. That's
Yeah.
hot.
Yeah, it was fun.
why'd you give it up?
You know, I was home upstate so infrequently, basically just on the weekends for
Right.
years, and it got to
What kind of Harley was it?
Softail Deluxe.
Nice.
Oh,
So
Does
I'm not
it-
gonna
is
act
it
like
ba-
I know about motorcycles. I don't.
Is it bad, like if to give a guy a ride on it? Like me on the back of it, would it look funny?
yeah, I had a solo seat. I didn't ride anybody on the back of it.
Well, what other groups are you part of there? Because the reason why I'm starting off with this is because I know that you're also part of. You were involved somehow with drug dependency and those issues, right? You're part of a
Yes.
group, right? What group is that?
It's a group called Cycle for Recovery.
Cycle for Recovery.
Yeah.
And what is it that they do?
So it's a group, it's a nonprofit that has a number of people on the board of directors and an advisory board, and they're selected based on their skills and their experience and their relationships to continue to contribute to the growth of the nonprofit. It started.
What do they do? How do they help
over-
drug addicts?
So what they do is they partnered with Soul Cycle, and they have cycling events. They had 2 in the fall, one in LA, one in New York, both sold out. They're looking to do a couple of more in the
So they're
beginning of
raising money
2020.
for people who are addicted to drugs?
Yeah, drug addiction and mental health issues.
How did you get involved in that? What brought you to that?
So, well, what really started my whole journey was my son was an addict, and it was a very, very difficult time in my life and my whole family's life. And it was while I was working. I was working at JetBlue when I really found out. Obviously, anybody you talk to, you're kind of in denial for a long time. But one day after,
What was his drug of choice?
well, he started out with actually prescription pills for a legitimate basketball injury, and
Seems
that
to be like the way it starts out.
it's sad, but it's true. So it started out with that, and it was Vicodin. That was the prescription that he was prescribed, and from there he went to oxycodone, and as the path goes, eventually went to heroin. So
And
that,
how far back were you talking about? How old was your son at the time?
probably around 23, 24 at the time.
It was
So
like 10 years ago?
yeah,
Because the opioid epidemic, it seems like, you talk about the epidemic, it sounds like it's something that's relatively new, but it took a couple of years to develop. I mean, they had to flood the market with these opioids first before they got everybody
well,
addicted.
I think part of it is that it just wasn't spoken about as much. I think it's been going on longer than all this messaging is coming out now, because it's affected everybody, across, the gamut, men, women,
It's
younger,
a national
older.
crisis now.
It's a crisis. And so there's so many dynamics to it. And, it's very difficult to deal with as a parent. It's very
You said this is
difficult.
while you were working with JetBlue
Yeah.
that you found out.
Yes.
And when you found out, did you find out when it was already at a bad point, or did you feel like you missed out on a lot of stuff, or did you notice right away something was off?
No, it's gradual, and it starts off with, tiredness, laziness, just not being the person that
Was he living with you?
Yeah, he was living at home. And
Was he working?
Yeah, he was working. He was a college graduate. So I was working, like I said. I was traveling a lot, wasn't home a real lot.
Do you think that had something to do with it?
No.
Were you still married at
No.
the time?
No.
So when your kids were growing up, you were married. Those years between like 14, 15, 16 where kids might start experimenting.
No, I was a single parent then as well. Yeah.
But you're working a lot. You're working as a captain in the
Right.
police department, and before that a lieutenant.
Mm-hmm.
Your hours are, one thing about the police department is the hours. You never know what it's always.
Right.
It's always what you're needed. What do they say? When
Needs
you're
of the service.
Needs of the service.
Department, yeah.
And you're out in Long Island commuting in. You have a son and a daughter.
Yeah.
All right, and but during those years, you feel like he wasn't doing drugs during those years, right?
Well, look, as a teenager, no doubt he was partying with his friends, but what wasn't happening was, what resulted, and that was getting involved with the pills and the oxycodone, and it started with this basketball injury that progressed to the point of him going to heroin.
What was it that he injured?
His thumb. I remember being
Because it's
at
funny
work.
because she goes his thumb.
Yeah.
His thumb.
Yeah, because he said...
You're not on drugs, are you? Because that's your pinky.
I'm sorry, his pinky. You're right. No,
listen.
his other thumb. No,
His second
seriously, he had sent me a picture. I was at work and it was completely dislocated, and I actually told him to go to the hospital. Which he did, and that's kind of how it all started. And so for a long time, I felt things weren't right. I would talk to him. I would say, are you on drugs? And, he'd be very defensive and deny it. No, I'm not. Stop saying I'm on drugs.
Because drugs, when you talk about street drugs and then you're talking about the opioid, that's a big problem too. Because one is being prescribed by the doctor originally, and the other ones you're buying in the street off a drug dealer. So when you ask your son, are you doing drugs? No, I'm not doing drugs. I'm doing. The doctor gave me this.
Yeah, but these days you have, even if you look in your own medicine cabinet and you see what's there, you're like, wow, if I had kids, I'd have to get rid of these.
I don't have nothing like that in my
No,
medicine.
well, if you go to a dentist, they prescribe
mine don't last-
oxycodone or something.
Yeah.
Mine don't
I
last
never
long
did
enough
it.
for my kids to
you
get a
take
hold
them
of
all?
No. If you give me some Vicodin, I'm going out and buying a bottle of Maker's Mark.
Yeah, but what eventually happened is, they find doctors who will just keep writing them prescriptions and
good.
prescriptions.
That was a big problem for a long time.
Yeah, it was a huge problem.
Which also leads to the heroin epidemic. My son had a friend of his that died of a drug overdose like 3 years ago. He was like 22 years old.
Yeah. I know so many people who lost, daughters or sons or, spouses, through this whole journey. I met so many people who lost their loved ones because of it.
And they must blame themselves, right?
Well, you just kind of look and, what could I have done wrong? And, like, how does this person, take a prescribed drug and they're fine, and this person, gets addicted to it? I just don't know. I'm not a doctor. I can only speak really to, what it did to our family, what it was like trying to get him help.
What was that like?
Well, the first time...
obviously, you said he said he wasn't addicted, right?
Right.
Well,
but
he's not doing drugs. That's what he said.
I got a phone call, and it was the end of June of 2005, I believe it was. And he called me up, and no, it wasn't 2005. I forget what year it was, but it was the end of June, and he said, I need help. He said, if I don't get to a rehab, he says, I'm going to be dead in a day. And that's really
scary.
It was very scary. So I immediately, started looking up rehabs locally, Nassau, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, anywhere in the tri-state. Nobody had beds.
When you say nobody had beds, you're cold calling and saying,
Yes.
listen, my son is addicted to opioids. He needs treatment right away. And
Right.
they're like, we can't help you.
Correct.
Wow.
Nobody had beds. I was able to find a place out in the Hamptons, and they said they could take him the next day. So I said, fine. He didn't have insurance. He was over the age of 26 at that point. He didn't have insurance. So I paid for it.
Wow.
I gave them my credit card.
It's a lot of money, I bet, right?
Yeah. And they came, and I actually went when they came to get him, and they picked him up in like a van, and they took him for a 30-day stint in rehab. So that was my first experience.
Loretta, if you don't mind, what did that cost?
That was $11,800, which, in the big spectrum, as I've spoken to many people, there are places you could spend $40,000, $50,000.
Right.
That's
I've
the
heard
initial
that.
30 days.
For the initial 30 days, well, the first few days are detox and then the rehab. And I remember having a conversation with a counselor, saying, is it better if I sent him to this place because it costs more and they have more? And he said, no. He said, it doesn't matter how much money you spend, it's all up to them if they want to get clean or not. So whether you're spending $50,000 a month or going no place,
right,
an outpatient, if that's what they want to do is get clean, then they'll get clean.
He was motivated, though, it sounded like.
Well, at that point, yeah, he was. And so he went out there, and I was able to visit him 2 weeks later. And I went there, and I just remember him walking in the hall towards me, and I just cried. Like, I hadn't even just seen that smile on his face in over 10 years. He looked great. He felt great. I went through the parent, introduction program with them. And so then he came out 2 weeks later, and he felt great. And he said, I'm never going back. I'm never doing this. And, and I felt, oh, my God, I finally got my son back. So that lasted maybe 2 or 3 months, and then began the cycle. And I began to learn that relapse is part of recovery. And so over the next 2 years, he was in and out of 7 different rehabs.
Wow.
And I, again, came to find out how difficult it is, to get a bed, as I met so many parents or spouses.
You can't call ahead and say, listen, my son's probably going to be needing this place because we're going to make a reservation for 3 months from now.
No, it just doesn't work that way. And, there were times where they would have beds, but they're being held for people who have been arrested and are in jail, say for drugs. So those beds are held for them. So there's like a whole, process that goes on there. So he went in and out of a couple of different places,
because the
up in
initial
Ellenville,
hit of $11,000, this is, it's like in the whole world, if you get him back and everything's fine and hunky-dory after that and you got your son back, that's nothing. But you're talking about 7 times, now it's adding up.
Well, so what happened was, once he got into the first place, I had laid out the money. So now he's eligible when he gets out for Medicare. Medicare, I'm sorry. So he's eligible for Medicare. So I'm looking up now to see like what he's entitled to being on Medicare now. And it's like a huge document. And I wind up on a page of reimbursements. So I just started reading about reimbursements. Well, I come to find out that when you go into a rehab facility, if you have no insurance and you eventually go on Medicaid, what happens is, for the 3 months prior to you going there, they will reimburse you for anything that Medicaid would have paid for if you had insurance.
Right.
So there I start the journey of trying to get my money back. And that took about 16 to 18 months of going into Brooklyn, standing online, not playing the role, trying to get reimbursement. Being jerked around is an understatement. Being sent from that location to one in Queens, to go to Nassau County, this and that.
They try to exhaust you so you don't do it.
Well, that's the bottom line. I don't know how people who so desperately need this help navigate the system. So I wind up going to court.
Do you think that your money was being held back maybe because you're a white lady and you had a job before? You want your money back?
I don't know why it was particularly being held back. I almost tend to think that people just give up. It's just so difficult to navigate. So I wind up going to a hearing with an attorney and a advocate, and I'm talking to them, and they're asking me, well, why should you get your money back? And I had everything photocopied and highlighted. On this page, it states this. And then the attorney would say, well, that's not true. And I was like, well, and I pull out another page. Well, on this page, it says I'm entitled to it. And she said, let me see that. And I'm thinking, like, you're the attorney. How do you not even know this? So anyway,
They probably never got that far.
I go through the whole process, and I get a letter back, and they basically denied me because what they call the CPT codes, those are the medical codes. Every time you go to the doctor and you get the bill, it has like some 4 or 5
decide
letters,
what they'll cover.
what code it is, right? Because the CPT codes weren't right. But in that hearing, they said that attorney was supposed to find out all those CPT codes. So I wrote them back and basically said, based on the letter I got, it wasn't my responsibility to find out the CPT codes. So long story short, I got back $11,000 of my original money.
You exhausted them,
But you want to know something?
and they exhausted you.
It was exhausting.
Yeah.
But needless to say, so now he's eligible for Medicaid. So that's what picked it up, for all these other visits. So, fast forward, we go through a different number of places. And he's in another place in the Hamptons now for a month. And by the way, I want to say this. When somebody's a heroin addict, a 30-day rehab is like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound.
Right.
It really, really is.
How long do you think now that you know about this, how long is an appropriate time for heroin addiction?
I think it depends on the person. I think it depends on their motivation. I think it depends on the family and friend support.
Well, heroin
and it mostly depends on the addict themselves.
Heroin is in the blood. So I'm talking about like actually a complete blood transfusion where this drug is out of your system completely.
Right.
Obviously it takes more than a month. Forget about your mental state and where you want to be. Heroin's different because it's calling you, it's pulling you, it's in your system. It's like you're a vampire.
It's psychological.
It's like you're a vampire. You need blood, they need heroin.
Right.
So to me, a year would probably be great. Because you have to, not only do you have to get them completely off of it, but now you have to get them back into a lifestyle where they feel like they're actually contributing to something, not just laying around kicking dirt, waiting to start doing drugs again.
Was he still living with you at this point?
What was that?
Was he still living with you at this point?
A lot of times he was actually living with my mother. My mother took him in a lot. As I went through this process, I joined an Al-Anon Group, which is like for the friends and families. And that was a big deal for me to even take that step because I was thinking, I don't want to go any place close. I'm embarrassed. I don't want to run into anybody I know. So I found a place on Long Island, but was quite a distance from where I had grown up and where my son had grown up. And I went in there, and I went there religiously for quite some time. And that kind of really put me in a place where, and I say this, let go, let God, where I had to let it go because as my husband would say, if Danny's okay, Loretta's okay. If Danny's not okay, Loretta's not okay. Because it consumes your life.
And it's someone else's addiction.
Correct, but it affects everybody.
Yeah.
And so I went there and I met some wonderful people there and, I just took a lot in. And they're so divided. Like some people will not take their addicts into their house. Other people will not put them on the street. It's a personal decision on what you want to do.
Was your son stealing? Was he at that point? Was he stealing things?
I'll tell you this. There are certain things that I don't know. There's certain things I don't want to know. Mm-hmm. He never stole from us. So he did have money, though. He went through everything he ever had. And he was working, through
the addiction?
Yeah, except at the very end when it got really bad. So he would go in and out of these rehabs.
What type of heroin is he doing? Is he shooting up or is he snorting? Or is he doing the oxycodone?
No, he wasn't doing pills anymore. He would have somebody would pull up in front of my mother's house, and he would go outside and he'd be gone for a few minutes. He'd come back. I never found a needle in my house, but I know that he was doing heroin. He told me he was doing heroin. So it's like I said, there's certain things that it's hard to ask. Mm-hmm. I just don't even want to know. I mean, I know a real lot. Mm-hmm. but it was most important for me to really never give up hope and try and get him the help that he needed. And so what happened was he's in another place out in the Hamptons for a month, and it was in December. He was scheduled to get out like January 1st or whatever. And there was a 3-month program at a place called St. Pete's, which is up in Saranac Lake. And I just happened to call up, and they had a bed. Like right at the same day he was getting released from the Hamptons. So anyway, we coordinated it. I drove from Long Island out
Is he
to the
okay with that?
Hamptons. Yeah.
So he's getting out after a month, and
he's going, and he's okay with going right up.
Because he knew he needed that extra help.
Correct. So I picked him up. I drove him 6 hours up to Saranac Lake in January. So it's 20 degrees below up there, and it was a beautiful old. It reminded me of the mansion in The Shining. Really nice backdrop in the mountains. It was a fabulous looking place. I walked him in the place, and they said, "You have to go now." Like I immediately had to walk out.
They didn't want you there.
No. And then I drove.
Why is that? What do you feel?
They just want to cut the ties. They want
Does
to
it have
take
anything
them.
to do with like codependency? Like maybe having the mother there, you rely on,
No, they just take them and they put him through that program. So he was there, and he actually left early. He left after about 2.5 months, and he got out. And
is that okay that he left it? That was his choice?
It wasn't my choice, but it was his. And
he's a man now.
Yeah. So he left, and he went and he lived in a homeless shelter out in Freeport, Long Island.
That's got to be something.
And
is that rock bottom, you think?
That was his that's what he told me was his defining moment when he lived in a homeless shelter.
Wow.
And I remember him saying, "Mom, I wasn't raised this way." And he turned his life around at that point. And the other thing that he said was one of the best things that happened for him was when I went to the Al-Anon meetings, because I really
understood.
I really let go and let God. And and he said that was a big factor too. He said he saw the change in me because I was no longer enabling him. I was
that's important, right?
Enabler.
As you say this, I probably can't think of anyone I know that doesn't have someone in their family that has this, whether it's alcohol, drugs, prescription drugs, heroin. Everyone in their family has someone in their family that has this.
They do.
Yeah.
They do. And sometimes people have more than one person in their family. So that's really, how I started getting involved with this. My son has been drug-free now over 5 years.
Wow. That's great.
He's, can we say he's happy, healthy, and helping others.
Is he back working?
Yeah, so what he did was he actually went out to California, where my daughter lives, and he had met at my daughter's wedding. The rabbi that married my daughter and my son-in-law was a former heroin addict and owned or had 2 rehab places out there. So he went to work there, and he finally was a director of a program in Santa Monica, literally right on the beach, like Muscle Beach was right there. He
picked a nice place to get sober.
Well, he was working. He was sober at the time. He was living out in California, and he was the director of the rehab program there, and helped a lot of people and met a lot of people. So while he was there, he would give my phone number to parents, like who sent their, because it was not cheap.
And you were okay with that?
Yeah. They would call and talk to me, and I'd have moms who would say, there's nobody in my town who has this problem, and I'd be like, they probably do. You just probably don't know about it.
Yeah.
And I was a big advocate for Al-Anon.
I think it's so, Loretta, it's so interesting that you learned that you were an enabler, which we probably all are, because this is your son, you love him, and you're going to do whatever you can for him, but you're not helping him.
Right.
When you enable someone. Right.
And not that I was giving him money and stuff, but, even when they, giving them places to live, like they have to get out and get on their own.
Yeah, get out.
Or
else they'll destroy you, too.
And the family relationships. Yeah. My son and daughter didn't talk to each other. My daughter was upset at me because she felt that he was destroying my life. And it's just a vicious cycle. Yeah. My mom would always take him in. She would never say no.
Those grandmas.
But he was very good to my mother. My mother was very good. They still to this day have a great relationship. So, so going through all the peaks and valleys of it, to be in the place I am today, I would have thought he'd been dead and buried a long time ago. And I'm very grateful that, things have worked out this way. But, you take one day at a time, too.
Absolutely.
And just, hope for the best all the time.
Wow. That's some journey, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, especially since, you were a cop. You were a captain on the police department. So where, the average, parent who's working, they're not seeing this kind of stuff. They're not around it all the time. And then when it happens to you and you're a cop, you're like, how did I not see this? How can I not detect it? How did I not know this was going on underneath my roof?
Well, the irony is, we talked about this before, is, here I am, like on the Lower East Side going in and out of these shooting galleries. When, I'm like 23, 24, 25 years old. I'm young. You're seeing all these junkies, laid out on some disgusting mattress, with a needle sticking out of their arm or whatever is going on. And, you just, it's just kind of like a job.
You're not even thinking about that person right there has a mother, a father, a
No,
grandmother.
you really don't.
Well, we have to put up those barriers. I used to say, too, you could go into an apartment, see two people's brains all over the floor, and you just go about your business like it's...
Well, that's a little bit different, though. I mean, if you do know...
Yeah, but then you see your own kid cut, and you're like, oh, my God.
Yeah. But also, too, with the drug addiction, when you're out there and you're a narcotics officer, you do develop that defense mechanism, but also, too, the way you treat them after the fact. There's a lot of bullshit crimes you want to, a turnstile thing. It's, or, shoplifting or anything else like that. You know what I'm saying? You're looking at them like they're not even human. They're subhuman. We have a bunch of different words that we use for them on the police department, too. Skell.
Mope.
Skell is a big one.
Mutt.
And now you're talking to somebody who realizes now, wow, that person has a mother somewhere maybe that's still alive, or a dad, or a brother, or a sister, or a grandmother.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. And, it's like I get choked up thinking about this. It's like...
Well, believe me, there's plenty of people that I work with in the police department and many other places that have struggled with this in a big, big way.
Because everybody has that in their family.
Everyone.
Like you said, everybody does.
My brother died of a drug overdose.
Yeah.
Prescription drugs, too. And I don't know whether it was accidental or accidentally on purpose, but he was, and then he had been sober for years from drinking because that was his number one problem. Mm-hmm. And then he started taking prescription drugs. And as I said, I don't know if he did it on purpose or if he just,
What is it about Al-Anon that it helped you so much as a parent? Like, what was it that they were telling you that really, like, okay, it helped the relationship because you had to back away a little bit? How do they prove that to you?
Yeah, so the program was Al-Anon. Like I said, it's for families and friends. It's just a place to sit and hear people's stories and, how they dealt with certain situations and, just kind of have a dialogue. And like I said, it's not to force anybody to have any one particular way to go about it, but, just take what, you feel would work for you. There were people who had been going to these meetings for like 25, 30 years. There were people who have been going to these meetings. Their loved ones have been deceased for a long time. They talk about the Serenity Prayer. When you're at these meetings, there are certain.
What is this? What's the Serenity Prayer?
It's a prayer that they say, every day. It's a spiritual type of prayer. Just very motivational and inspirational.
Is that like the AA thing, the 12-step things from AA?
Well, it's kind of based on that, as well. And they bring in guest speakers sometimes, like people. Like there was one woman, for example, her daughter came in who had recovered and spoke about her journey. And it's really good to see the people in the group where there's a success story where you can hear, what went on.
People get healed.
What advice could you give to parents that have an intuition or maybe an idea that their son or their daughter might be on drugs, or that their son or daughter's friends might be on drugs? Like, if there was one bit of advice that you can give, not only with the fact that you were law enforcement, but also the parent of a child that was addicted to drugs.
Well, I would say the first thing to do is to speak to them very early on, before this could even potentially be a problem. Once you start suspecting something and you feel it in your gut, it's probably been happening for longer than you even know.
Did you ignore it for a long time?
I was in denial, I would say.
So you ignored the obvious signs.
When I did speak to him, he was very defensive, very argumentative. I'm just tired or whatever
Right.
his excuse was. And I'm not making that as an excuse for myself, but it's really hard to wrap your head around when it's your own kid.
Yeah, sure.
It really, really is.
Sometimes we all choose the path of least resistance too.
Yeah. Like hopefully this will just
Just
go
go away, yeah.
It's a phase. But, I didn't even know that he was doing heroin, at that point. So, like I said, the path I took led me to where I am today. I'm glad I stayed the course, like as angry as my son would get with me. I never backed off.
That's for us, by the way, the grease board.
I never.
We have our producer. She's still putting ideas or questions up there, and so sometimes the guests see it and they feel like they have to answer. No, that's for us. You just, to tell us what you're telling us. Don't be worried about that.
Yeah, I just refuse to give up hope.
You can't. I mean, it's your child, for crying out loud.
As much as I really didn't
never give
know
up.
if he would make it, you just can't give up.
But it's tough to say no. Like Bill brought up earlier about the living arrangement, and you said at some point your son would stay with your mother.
Yeah.
His grandmother. So there must have been a point where you told him, "Don't bring this in the house. Or don't come here. You're not welcome here."
What I did was I sold my house.
So he didn't have a place to live anymore.
I sold my house and I moved. And
was that a conscious decision because of that? You didn't want to have his room there no more.
It was a large part of it.
Wow, that's interesting.
It's
Really. And what'd you do? You just got yourself a one bedroom apartment?
Yeah. And so, when you have kids and they're little and you go in and see them in the cribs and you just watch and see if their chest rises to see if they're breathing. Well, imagine doing that
for an
to
adult.
like your 25-year-old, your kid, see them sprawled out on bed and just staring at them, just wanting to see like their shirt move or something,
right.
To see if they were breathing or not.
That's scary, man.
But the addiction destroys the parents almost as bad as it does the addicted person.
Yeah, well, it certainly can destroy relationships.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
That's why that Al-Anon was so important. That you did that. That was smart.
Yeah.
We
What's
had
it called?
Al-Anon.
It's called
Narcotics Anonymous.
Yeah, Al-Anon.
No, we had a Dr. Wachskull here who's an expert on police suicide and stuff. And we, some of the things we talk about as cops, this question I thought, for me, I'm not saying it was the greatest question, but for me, it was good. I said, is it ever okay, to drink, mentally? And he goes, yeah, absolutely. He goes, as long as it doesn't get crazy. He goes, because we as cops, sometimes after a really horrendous situation, you want to go out and talk about it and just have a few cocktails. And I'm not saying do a 4 to 4, but just even when we make a big arrest or something, we almost want to celebrate it. You know what I mean? And that's like a positive thing, and, it does deal with alcohol, so it could get out of control. But he was, as a PhD, he was like, "Oh no, it's fine to drink as long as you don't go over."
Well, just as long as we got the okay from the Waskell.
Dr. Waskell.
We'll go out and throw a couple.
So don't ever quote me again.
Do you go to Los Angeles often to visit your son?
Well, he lives back in New York now.
Oh, okay, that's great.
But I go to Los Angeles quite a bit because my daughter lives out there.
Now, is he still working as a counselor?
No. He did that for 2 or 3 years, and he just didn't like the whole LA scene.
Yeah.
And it's
LA's
different.
fun. The sun shines most of the time, and the feeling's laid back.
So, no. He came back here and actually went into managing a restaurant. Ironically,
that's tough when as an addict to do that.
Ironically, the man who owned the restaurant, he owns a couple of them, and this one happened to be in Times Square. His son was one of my son's clients out in L.A.
Wow.
And so he got to have a good relationship with my son, and he offered him a job, and so he's kind of back in that restaurant.
Yeah, because I mean,
business thing.
being around alcohol is.
Yeah, but you know
know?
what? Alcohol was never his real thing. He wasn't really a big drinker or anything
I'm addicted
like
to Cabernet.
Cabernet.
Really good Cabernet from
Yeah.
Napa Valley.
I like yeah. So, so, he's doing that, and,
That's
just,
great.
living life. Travels a lot, He wants to have some experiences. He travels all over the world pretty
Well,
much.
that's great.
Yeah, he takes off and goes on. He still goes to meetings. He's still,
I think that's
involved.
important. Right? I don't think that's something that ever ends, right?
No, and they're good. They're good for him, and he talks to me about them, and he tells me what makes him feel good. We have the best relationship that we've ever had. We have a really great relationship now. Very
It's almost,
open, very honest.
I know it's drugs, but especially with heroin and what it does to you. We mentioned earlier about how it goes through your veins and it does something to your brain, and that's why it takes so long to get out of your system. But it's almost like an illness in a way. Like you wouldn't wish cancer on anybody, right? But you also wouldn't wish a drug addiction like heroin either, because it's going to take probably the chances of you surviving it are probably the same too, and the time to get better and what you have to go through.
Well, I learned more about addiction and heroin than I ever thought in my life I would know. When they detox, it takes them about 3 or 4 days to detox. That heroin's out of their system. Mm-hmm. It's all
In the psych, yeah.
It's the psych part that's so overwhelming and just has a grasp on them. And, I've seen shows and other parents talk and, how they lost their kids and how they were doing well, but something triggers them. And, they talk about people, places, and things. Those are the things that will trigger to go back. Like, how do you have, like, an addict, and I forget some actor's name. He didn't do heroin for, 10 years. He bought some on the Lower East Side
the guy
or
who
something.
died, Hoffman. Seymour Hoffman.
Oh,
Philip
God,
Seymour Hoffman.
yeah.
What
Yeah.
a great actor.
What a great
That's
actor.
shame.
Right.
Yeah.
So here's the guy, 10 years clean. It's
Yeah.
what happened there? And the reality is most of them know you can't use the same amount that you used the last time.
Right.
And so easy to overdose.
Yeah, but I think he was already, he was clean for a while, like you said, 10 years. But I don't think that was the first
Well,
time.
look, great
Because apparently he had
example.
a bunch
Audie
of-
Lang. Audie Lang now has been sober for 10 months, I think.
Yeah, I don't.
Right.
Yeah,
And I think
close.
cocaine was his drug of choice. But
Both of them. He's
Both?
speedballer. Yeah. Artie Lang's a great guy, and there's so many addicts out there who are wonderful people, and we wish them nothing but the best. And if you're out there and you're involved in law enforcement, think about that before you just ready to kick somebody to the curb. That that's somebody's son, daughter, maybe even a captain on the police department, man. Because nobody is above it. Nobody is above it, and especially when these drugs that some of the people are doing are prescribed initially by doctors. You know what I'm saying? And that's where, somebody who's never done drugs before, next thing you know, they're shooting heroin because it's something that a doctor gave them. That they're basically pushing it on the market.
Yeah, and the thing too is like we talked about earlier, is getting the treatment and getting the help. There are people, I met a lot of people whose kids were in different treatment centers and they were under the age of 26. They were still under their parents' insurance. And their insurance may only approve them for a week stay. That's nothing.
Right.
It's nothing.
It's like nothing.
that's why when you go in the police department, they say, always get the high option rider in case you have to go to the farm.
Yeah. Yeah. But so, what Cycle for Recovery is doing, like I said earlier, they're looking to provide grants and funds for those who really desperately want to get help, who may not have the funds. So part of the board's responsibility is to get those applicants, to review them, to see what the needs are, what specific location might be good for that person, and to monitor them. So I would encourage, especially our law enforcement community, if you've got a family member, a friend, a spouse, who's struggling and you need the support, the website's www.cycleforrecovery.org.
Cycle, CYCLE, right?
Yeah, for recovery.
And you got, what it is,
.org.
like bike rides and stuff like that? You go on long trips in order to raise
Well,
money
they
for this?
partnered with Soul Cycle right now.
I used to take spin till I got my new hip. I haven't been back since.
Yeah.
Soul Cycle's
Yeah. So what they do is
It's a tough class.
It's pricey too, man. It's like 30, $40 for one class.
Yeah. Well, they'll donate all that money for the specific day.
Now you got to get the
towards
Peloton
helping.
at home.
Yeah.
Don't buy it for your wife though.
Yeah.
Let her buy it herself.
Yeah. So, as a parent, some of the things obviously to look for is, change in behavior, change in friends. You hear about this all the time, but yet when it happens to you, you're just really kind of not looking. Friends, if they lose their jobs, if they have a bank account that they've gone through, maybe you're noticing, like if you see if they have credit card bills, their credit cards are run out,
Right.
things like that.
Did your daughter
And
know
just-
about this before you?
No, no. And that's another thing is, all my son's friends, they all grew up together through pre-K
It's a close-knit
all the way.
community
Yes,
call
it
place,
is.
yeah.
And only one of them, his name is Joe, reached out to me and said, we need to do an intervention with Danny.
That's a good friend.
Let me tell you something. And all those friends, nobody ever said anything to
And
me.
they knew it, right?
Of course they did. And
It's like the cop that sees his partner's out of control and never goes to a boss and says, look, this guy needs help.
Right.
And then he commits suicide and he says, oh, I saw all these signs. Then why didn't you tell anybody?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, but how many of those kids are also maybe not as addicted as your son, but
On the way.
doing it with your son, doing it themselves, have their own problems. Also the ratting thing out. Like, people don't want to be rats or telling on somebody's mother. You don't know who had to talk with them, long conversations. How many of them who he's still really tight with? Because you also alienate yourself. The more you get involved in these drugs, the
Right.
more you kind of sort of stay to yourself. Maybe a lot of those friends weren't reaching, oh, how come you're coming out tonight? Oh, I don't feel good, So they don't see the real addiction,
Yeah.
I bet you a lot of them knew, though.
And the hard part is when they do come out of rehab, the friends want to be supportive too, but, they don't always respect their sobriety.
Yeah,
And
that's
so
tough.
it
That's
may
tough.
be cool for them to pop a beer or smoke a joint or whatever,
But they don't understand.
but they don't understand you cannot do that kind of
Right,
stuff.
that's true.
Yeah, I remember with
and
Artie.
that's
So
what's
speaking
really
of Artie
hard.
Lang, the first time I saw him come out of a rehab it wasn't his first time in a rehab. The first time I happened to be around him, knowing that he came out of rehab not too long ago, and I was over. I knew his drink of choice, which was my drink of choice, and we were both at the comedy club. And I recall having a drink in my hand, and now I regret that so much because I'm thinking to myself, because I've seen a picture since then, since his last rehab. And somebody took a picture of him holding a beer, and it's like almost like you want to take all that stuff away. Like, no, take it away. Take it. The guy's doing good, man. Don't give him any thought. Don't make him look like it's fun. Because when you see you're out and you're seeing other people having fun when they're drinking, all of a sudden, I can have one drink, but we all know what
No, you
happens
can't.
after that.
Yeah.
No, you can't do that.
So that's wow, man. What a story, man. It's really I'm happy that you came in here, and the first half was great, but this half I think we learned a lot about this an addiction and how it could hit anity, no matter what you
Absolutely.
do for a living, even if you're involved in law enforcement, even if you're a captain on the NYPD.
The other thing too is there's so much, and I don't think I'm alone in feeling this way. There's so much shame and embarrassment that the only people who really knew were my family. Like I was going to work and functioning fine.
Right.
And I remember one day, our executive assistant, Kathy, wonderful lady, she walked into my office, and I don't know what came over me, but she looked at me, she's like, what's wrong? And I just blurted it out. I said, my son's a heroin addict.
Wow.
And it's the first time I was able to talk to somebody and just spill my guts about it.
Right.
And she was so helpful to me and supportive.
Did she wind up having someone in her family, too, that was...
No. But she was a great friend. But there was so much embarrassment, and when you brought up, it's about somebody who has cancer, and I've had this conversation with people too. If your kid has cancer or they get some other disease, everybody's great and they raise money, and I donate a lot of money, and I'm sure everybody else does to certain causes. When somebody's kid is an addict. Yeah. It's not the kind of thing like
It's a different
people
problem.
It's
yeah.
a different problem, and there's not a lot of funds and fundraising to get them help and this and that. And I'm not suggesting people should stop everything they're doing
Right.
for this, but it is a reality, and that's why it's so
Well, I think
difficult
Eric
for
Clapton
people.
has that group called Crossroads, and he has a rehab on one of the Caribbean islands. Yeah, because he
Okay.
was a heroin addict
Yeah,
years ago. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's not an isolated problem. Many families go through it. I would, like you said earlier, most families have somebody with some sort of addiction in there.
Yeah.
The way they snuck it into our, there's a what do you call it? Conspiracy theory that the crack epidemic was started by the government, for whatever reason, to kill off black people, kill their incentive, destroy the culture, whatever. But then there's also a theory that the prescription drugs were put in. Two theories I've heard. One of them is because to combat the marijuana that's coming, they wanted to beat out on marijuana. So you know what I'm saying? So we don't lose, get people hooked on these drugs instead of doing marijuana that's soon to be legal, and also that it was flooded to kill white people. That's a theory that's out there. It sounds ridiculous, but because the opioid epidemic has mostly struck white people.
Yeah.
And where you had so much help for right now, we gotta counter this this opioid addiction because we're losing a lot of white people. There's a lot of people who were hooked on crack for years and years and years, and there was no government assistance coming from them. They were just crackheads.
Well, when you went to prison, that's the only way they got rehab, right?
Mm-hmm.
I had guys out on the street would say, "Officer, please, could you get me in a rehab?" You'd be like, "Dude, I can't help you." And then they get locked up. They get right in.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's what you were talking about before, the beds.
Mm-hmm.
When they're saving beds for people who aren't even there yet, but just somebody who copped a plea instead of doing the amount of time that they were supposed to do initially, if they become part of this program, then they'll cut their time, and they'll go to rehab, which actually helps in a way too, because they have a drug problem. They probably wouldn't be criminals if they weren't addicted to this drug.
Yeah, it's just a vicious cycle.
Knowing what you know about this now, do you think Big Pharma had something to do with this, like what I mentioned earlier? Are you a conspiracy theorist? Do you think these drugs were flooded by Big Pharma to either?
Well, there's certainly news stories out there which would support that. Depending what you read. I mean, when you read about things that went on in places like West Virginia and the incredible amounts of oxycodone and pills that went through such small communities. Why did that happen? And I read this book called Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. It was actually a really good book. And he, grew up over in that area and talked about, the addiction problems there and with all the drugs flooding in as he grew up. And, like why and how did that happen? Mm-hmm. Obviously, they were making a lot of money. Mm-hmm. I've seen read news reports or read things, where there's information where they knew how addictive these drugs were and they just didn't do anything about it. So now, it's had a
Well, why would they
effect.
want to addict a whole community, say in West Virginia?
Well, the drugs were coming through there,
Okay.
like into a pharmacy, like just ridiculous amounts.
They
of
had
drugs.
way more pills than there were people there.
Right,
Even
okay.
if you gave 1,000 pills to every single person that lived in that town, there would still be 10 million more pills coming through that town. Right. It was basically like a hub to distribute either illegally throughout the country, but that's where they were going first for some reason. A lot of it has to. I watched the same thing that you watched. It's disgusting. But since we have you now, and you were a parent with a child with an addiction, and you've been through the whole thing. We mentioned Al-Anon. I keep saying it wrong.
Al-Anon. Yeah.
And you also talked about what to look out for. And how did you heal yourself? What did you have to go through while all this was going on? How did you stay mentally stable? Because that's important, just to
Yeah, you have to take care of yourself, for sure. I just had to learn to let it. I had to learn that I could not control what his decisions were going to be. I could not continue to clean up his messes. It's his life. He was the only one who could make himself clean. There's nothing in the world I could have done to make him stop using drugs. No amount of begging and crying and, don't do it would have worked. And it took a long time. It took a long time to get there. And I'm there now. And he knows it. He knows if something ever happens, you know who to call, and you know where to go, and you know what you have to do. I'm feel really good
it destroys
that it won't
it
happen.
destroys families. It destroys
Absolutely.
mothers, fathers. And because you'll give anything to your kid,
I've
but
met
he's destroying
people,
you.
I've met people who have gone through hundreds of thousands of dollars to their lifetime saved 401ks to get their kids help.
Wow.
And it's unbelievable what people have done. And naturally, the other kids in the family, are talking to the parents saying,
They're
well,
pissed.
Why?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, they are.
Right.
Why are you spending
The
all
squeaky
this money?
wheel gets the grease, as they say, right?
Yeah.
All you can tell them is, you know what, have your own kids and then come back and talk to me, because that's what it's about. Once you have kids, you'll do anything, whatever you can do.
But
Any
you can
sacrifice that
understand the
make.
resentment when.
And part of that sacrifice is being able to say no and doing all the steps. Everything that you said, it's just remarkable of how strong you are, because you made it to the captain on the NYPD. Then you had this wonderful job. You wouldn't tell us how much money you make, but we know that you were very happy of yourself.
She
I was
didn't-
very happy with the job.
She didn't touch the thing about the animals on the plane either. She didn't really want to talk
No,
about
she's
that
not
too much.
bad-mouthing.
No, she won't say anything bad about JetBlue. Like, it was like an
No.
ark. It was like
It's a
you
great
had to bring
place.
2 animals.
And
with
on
you.
top of all that, to have the strength to be there for your son, and the fact that he came out of it and he's doing okay now. And we all know that with addiction, it's every day counts. Every day's a brand new day. So we wish him all the best. And if you're a parent out there, heed this advice. We're gonna put up some stuff at the end of the episodes. The way we've been doing some contact information, and Bill and I are also building up the website. We got to talk about that. Where we're gonna have a page or two there dedicated to all the people, all the different services that you can go to reference if you have a child who is autistic or who's suffering from addiction, and all these different things that could go wrong in a human life. We're gonna have stuff like that you can, a resource page that you can go to. But Bill, anything else?
No, I mean, I worked with Loretta. She was a great captain. I didn't expect anything less from her today. This was a great episode. We appreciate your journey and that you still want to help people. That's great.
Yeah, for sure. Anything I can do.
We're gonna
Nice.
we're gonna need that cycle for the thing there, so we can add that to the give that to Rashad.
Cycleforaddiction.org, is that
Rashad on the way out. We want to add that website.
Cycle for Recovery.
Cycleforrecovery.org. Okay.
And I'll try and get you the dates of the cities and where
Where
they're
it's
gonna
going
have
on.
them,
If you like
and
bike riding,
absolutely, it's
I'm
great
not-
exercise. I cycle.
I'll
too.
donate. I'm not a big bike rider. I fall off a lot. But thank you so much for coming in, Loretta. It was a pleasure
Great,
and an honor.
thank you.
And wish you the best of luck. And on behalf of Police Off the Cuff, man, this was a great episode, man. I'm very, very proud of you. Thank you so much. Keep tuning in.